Southwest Flight 1380. Jennifer Reardon was 43 years old, a mother of two from Albuquerque, New Mexico, a vice president at Wells Fargo on a Boeing 737 headed home from a business trip to New York. She was sitting in the window seat of row 14 on April 17, 2018. About 20 minutes into the flight, the aircraft was cruising at 32,000 feet over Pennsylvania. There was no warning, a single loud bang from the left side, then everything happened at once. The 737 rolled sharply to the left. Oxygen masks dropped. Cabin pressure dropped with them. Wind roared through the aircraft from the row where Jennifer was sitting because her window had just been shattered by debris from the failed engine E, and the vacuum outside pulled her partway out of the plane. Two male passengers seated nearby grabbed her and pulled her back inside while the flight attendants fought the wind. A registered nurse rushed forward and helped perform CPR as the aircraft diverted toward Philadelphia. Captain Tammy Jo Schultz, a former Navy fighter pilot, brought the crippled 737 down to Philadelphia in a calm, textbook emergency landing. Jennifer did not survive. She was the first passenger fatality on a Southwest flight in the airline's 51-year history. Investigators found that a fan blade inside the left engine had cracked years earlier from metal fatigue. That crack had been slowly growing since at least 2012, hidden from the visual inspections being used at the time. 3 days later, the Federal Aviation Administration changed the rule. Every commercial aircraft flying that engine had to be inspected with the specific technology capable of finding those hidden cracks on a strict schedule from that point forward. Thousands of fan blades across the global fleet. Every one of those inspections happens because Jennifer Reardon sat in seat 14A. British Airways Flight 5390. A grown man, wearing a captain's uniform, was somehow pinned to the outside of a passenger aircraft cruising at 17,300 feet. His legs were trapped inside the cockpit, tangled near the flight controls. His body was flapping against the fuselage in a 300-mile-per-hour wind, and he was still alive. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden had just entered the cockpit with a cup of tea. He lunged forward and grabbed Lancaster's belt with both hands. He would hold on for the next 20 minutes. When Ogden's arms began failing from the cold, the wind, and exhaustion, other crew members took over. Everyone in the cockpit at that point believed Lancaster was already dead. First Officer Alistair Atchison ordered them not to let go anyway, out of fear that the captain's body could damage a wing or engine on the way out. Atchison brought the aircraft down for an emergency landing at Southampton. Lancaster survived. Frostbite, multiple fractures, deep shock. Back in the cockpit 5 months later. The rest of the passengers never knew what had happened up front. Investigators found that when the windscreen had been replaced 27 hours before the flight, 84 of the 90 bolts holding it in place were the wrong size, fitted by a maintenance manager who had matched them visually rather than reading the manual. Investigators recommended tighter oversight and independent verification for critical maintenance tasks, because one wrong maintenance shortcut almost pulled a captain out of the sky, and Nigel Ogden did not let go. United Airlines Flight 811. At 22,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, 16 minutes into a routine climb from Honolulu, the forward cargo door of a Boeing 747 blew off in mid-flight. It was February 24, 1989. United Airlines Flight 811 was bound for Auckland with 337 passengers and 18 crew on board. In the darkness at the front of the cabin, business class passengers across rows 8 through 12 on the right side of business class felt nothing that could possibly have prepared them for what happened next. The door tore the entire side of the aircraft open. The rush of decompressing air ripped the cabin floor and then ripped the seats out of it. 9 passengers, still strapped into their seats, were pulled out into the Pacific night. None of them were ever found. Among them was Lee Campbell, a 24-year-old New Zealander flying home. His parents, Kevin and Susan Campbell, could not accept the original NTSB explanation that blamed a ground crew. They launched their own investigation from Auckland. For 2 years, they collected documents, cross-referenced reports, pushed against Boeing, and pushed against the FAA. In October 1990, the cargo door was finally recovered from 14,200 feet below the ocean. It confirmed what the Campbells had been arguing all along. The latching mechanism itself had been faulty, a design flaw Boeing had known about since the 1970s. Every Boeing 747 cargo door in commercial service worldwide was ordered redesigned. Aluminum locking sectors were replaced with stronger materials. Outward opening cargo door mechanisms across the industry were rebuilt around the failure that had taken Lee Campbell and 8 other passengers. The redesign exists because 2 grieving parents from New Zealand refused to accept the first answer they were given. Piedmont Airlines ground accident. The most dangerous zone at any airport in the world is the ground. Statistically, ramp workers face dangers most passengers never think about: jet blast, moving aircraft, spinning propellers, and engine ingestion zones. Courtney Edwards is why some of them will now go home. Courtney was 34 years old, a ramp agent for Piedmont Airlines, a mother of 3, working the New Year's Eve shift at Montgomery Regional Airport in Alabama on December 31, 2022. An Embraer 175 arrived from Dallas-Fort Worth. Its auxiliary power unit had failed, so the captain kept both engines running for a 2-minute cool-down while ground crews connected external power. 2 safety briefings had been held before the aircraft arrived to remind the ramp team the engines would stay running. The aircraft's rotating warning light was on. The first officer physically opened the cockpit window to shout down to the ground crew. Courtney walked directly in front of the number 1 engine anyway. Co-workers had already tried to wave her back. She was pulled off her feet and pulled inside. The passengers on board felt the aircraft shake and heard the sudden shutdown of the left engine, but were never told what had actually happened. The NTSB investigation found signs of cognitive impairment. Courtney was living with multiple sclerosis. The exact role that condition played that day could not be fully determined. What was determined was that the industry had built a ground safety culture where planes with running engines and inoperative auxiliary power units were routinely being approached by workers under time pressure. Piedmont's parent airline, American, updated its ground operations protocols. Occupational Safety and Health Administration cited Piedmont for training failures. Across the industry, ramp safety training was reviewed with new urgency. Because Courtney Edwards, a mother of 3, walked in front of an engine she had been warned about on a night when nobody sitting in the cabin above her knew her name. ValuJet Flight 592. There were 3 words on the shipping label of 5 cardboard boxes loaded into the forward cargo hold of a DC-9 in Miami on May 11, 1996. The words read, "Oxy canisters, empty." One of those words was wrong. The canisters were not empty. They were expired chemical oxygen generators, some still capable of producing oxygen and extreme heat when triggered. The generators had been removed from aircraft during maintenance and were being shipped back to ValuJet headquarters. A subcontractor called SaberTech had packed them without safety caps, stacked them on top of 3 airplane tires, and mislabeled the paperwork. The ValuJet ramp agent and first officer accepted the shipment without questioning the contents. Shortly after takeoff from Miami, one of the generators activated by itself. The heat ignited the tires. The tires became fuel for a fire fed by oxygen from the generators. The fire became hot enough to burn through the control cables running near the cargo compartment ceiling. Passengers began screaming, "Fire! Fire!" into the CVR record. The pilots requested an emergency return. Minutes later, the DC-9 rolled inverted and plunged nose first into the Everglades at over 400 miles per hour. All 110 people on board were lost. Within days, the FAA banned the transport of chemical oxygen generators as cargo on passenger aircraft unless they were properly prepared and made safe. The crash also helped force a major change to Class D cargo compartments. Passenger aircraft cargo holds had to move toward active smoke detection and fire suppression instead of relying on sealed compartments to starve a fire of oxygen. No U.S. passenger airline has suffered another fatal accident like ValuJet 592 from a hidden cargo hold fire, because 110 people did not survive a shipment that arrived at the plane with the wrong word on the label. PSA Flight 182. Ma, I love ya. That is the last thing Captain James McFerrin said into the cockpit voice recorder of a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727. His aircraft was seconds from the ground and there was nothing left he could do. 90 seconds earlier, everything had been normal. September 25, 1978, just after 9 a.m. over San Diego. Clear weather. Flight 182 as descending toward Lindbergh Field with 135 people on board. Air traffic control had told the crew about a small Cessna 172 climbing away from an approach practice below them. McFerrin and First Officer Fox reported having the Cessna in sight. Then, as they descended, they lost sight of it. They kept flying anyway. Neither told the controller. The 727 overtook the Cessna at 2,600 feet and clipped it from above with its right wing. The small aircraft disintegrated on impact. The Boeing rolled sharply, then began to fall. Both wrecks came down in a San Diego residential neighborhood called North Park. 135 people on the 727, 2 in the Cessna, and 7 more on the ground did not survive. 22 homes were destroyed or damaged. It was, at that moment, the deadliest aviation accident in United States history. 8 years later, a nearly identical mid-air collision over Cerritos, California, killed 82 more people. The FAA had run out of chances to keep relying on pilots to visually see each other in a crowded sky. Every commercial aircraft flying today has a traffic collision avoidance system in the cockpit that tracks other aircraft in real time and physically instructs the pilots to climb or descend to avoid collision. It became mandatory because too many families had heard a version of what McFerrin said in his last recorded breath. American Airlines Flight 191. A forklift saved American Airlines about 200 hours of maintenance labor per engine change. It also killed 273 people. The DC-10's engine change procedure, as specified by McDonnell Douglas, required maintenance crews to remove the engine from the pylon first, then remove the pylon from the wing as a separate step. American Airlines, along with a handful of other U.S. carriers, had quietly developed their own faster procedure. They used a forklift to lower the engine and pylon as a single unit. It saved time. It also introduced tight clearances between the pylon flange and the wing that a forklift could not manage precisely enough to avoid contact. If the pylon shifted during reinstallation, it could strike the wing hard enough to damage the aft bulkhead of the pylon itself. Damage that was almost invisible unless a maintenance inspector knew exactly where to look, and that would grow into a fatigue crack over the following weeks of normal flight operations. On March 30, 1979, a DC-10 came into the American Airlines maintenance base in Tulsa, Oklahoma for its scheduled service. The forklift procedure was used, the pylon shifted, the bulkhead was damaged. Nobody caught it. That aircraft, registered November 110 Alpha Alpha, was returned to service. 8 weeks later, on the afternoon of May 25th, November 110 Alpha Alpha was cleared for takeoff from Chicago O'Hare's runway 32R as American Airlines Flight 191, bound for Los Angeles. 258 passengers and 13 crew were on board. The aircraft rotated. Photographs from ground witnesses captured the exact moment the pylon aft bulkhead finally failed. The entire left engine, pylon, and a 3-foot section of the wing's leading edge tore free, flipped up and over the top of the wing, and landed on the runway. Hydraulic lines were severed. Left wing slats retracted asymmetrically. The DC-10 stalled, rolled inverted, and crashed into a trailer park 4,600 feet from the end of the runway. 271 on the aircraft and 2 more on the ground did not survive. 31 seconds after takeoff. Every DC-10 in the United States was grounded. Inspections found 6 other aircraft with damage from the same shortcut procedure. One of them was so far along in metal fatigue that another crash was likely inevitable. The FAA banned the forklift procedure. Type certification for the first time formally included maintenance procedures, not just aircraft design. Every airline that had been running unauthorized maintenance shortcuts was ordered to stop. Because 273 people did not survive a forklift. Swissair Flight 111. The crew followed the smoke checklist they had, but the fire was already moving faster than the checklist could save them. They diverted to the nearest suitable airport. They dumped fuel to reduce landing weight, as procedure required for a heavy widebody, and it still cost them their chance to reach the runway. On the night of September 2, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 with 229 people on board, cruising at 33,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean bound from New York to Geneva. About 53 minutes into the flight, the pilot smelled smoke in the cockpit and initially believed it was an air conditioning problem. They declared a pan urgency and began a diversion to Halifax, Nova Scotia. What they could not see, invisible above their heads, was that an arcing wire in the newly installed in-flight entertainment system had already ignited the thermal insulation blankets lining the ceiling of the aircraft. That insulation was made of mylar. It had passed every flammability test the industry required. It burned anyway. The fire raced through the overhead space toward the cockpit. Electrical systems began failing one by one. The pilots dumped fuel as the checklist demanded. Then, 5.5 minutes later, with instruments failing and the cockpit filling with flames, the aircraft went down in the Atlantic 5 nautical miles from Peggy's Cove. All 229 people were lost. The investigation concluded that the mylar insulation had passed its flammability certification because the test itself was insufficient. The material was tested as a single flat sheet, not in the installed configuration where multiple layers reflected heat back onto each other and turned a fire-resistant panel into a fire propagator. The crash forced major changes to aircraft insulation standards, wiring oversight, entertainment system certification, and in-flight fire procedures. The lesson became brutal and simple. When there is smoke or fire in flight, the clock matters more than a perfect checklist.